It was a bitterly cold winter night in Portland, Oregon, and Oliver Grayson had just moved into a new apartment downtown. The building was old but charming, a pre-war structure with creaky floors and ornate molding. At 27, Oliver was excited to start fresh after a messy breakup, throwing himself into his work as a graphic designer and leaving his past behind. The apartment had one odd quirk, a door at the end of the hallway that didn't lead anywhere. The landlord had told him it was a storage room that had been sealed off years ago during renovations. No point in worrying about it, the landlord had shrugged. But that door felt wrong. A week after moving in, Oliver started hearing noises at night, soft thuds and faint whispers, as if someone was pacing behind the sealed door. He chalked it up to old pipes or the neighboring unit and ignored it. One night, he woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. The apartment was eerily silent, except for a faint creak. He turned his head toward the hallway and froze. The door was ajar. Oliver stared, heart pounding. He knew it had been sealed shut when he moved it. He crept toward the door, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The gap was pitch black, no light spilling out. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The door creaked wider, but nothing emerged. Against his better judgment, Oliver grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. He pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small room that definitely hadn't been there before. It was empty except for an old wooden chair in the center. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Something about the room made his skin crawl, as if the space itself were wrong. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. Oliver's flashlight flickered. He spun around, gripping the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the air grew colder, his breath visible in the dim light. Then he heard it, a low murmur, like a crowd of voices just out of reach. They grew louder, overlapping until he could make out individual words. "Help us! Why did you come here? You shouldn't have opened the door." Oliver backed into the corner, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The shadows in the room began to shift, moving against the light. The murmurs stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Oliver's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but then he saw it, a tall, lanky figure emerging from the shadows. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long and its head tilted unnaturally. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Its face was featureless, a smooth void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. "Who? What are you?" Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head and raised a bony finger, pointing at him. The door behind Oliver creaked open, and a force yanked him backward, flinging him into the hallway. Oliver slammed the door shut and shoved a chair under the handle. His heart raced as he tried to process what had just happened. When he finally mustered the courage to look again, the door was sealed shut, just as it had been when he moved in. For weeks, Oliver avoided the hallway entirely. He threw himself into his work and tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare. But the whispers continued, growing louder each night. And then he started seeing it. Reflections in windows, shadows that didn't belong, always the same featureless figure, watching him. Desperate for answers, Oliver spoke to one of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Kaplan who had lived in the building for decades. "That room," she said, her voice trembling, "shouldn't exist. It's been sealed off for a reason." "What reason?" Oliver pressed. She hesitated before replying. "The man who lived there before you disappeared. Just like the one before him. And the one before that." Oliver's stomach churned. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "They don't tell anyone," she whispered. "They're too afraid." That night, Oliver decided he had to face whatever was in the room. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, he pried the door open. The room was exactly as he remembered it, but this time, the chair wasn't empty. The featureless figure sat there, its head cocked as if waiting for him. "I'm not afraid of you," Oliver lied, gripping the crowbar tightly. The figure stood, its movements unnervingly smooth. The walls of the room began to close in, the space warping and bending like a funhouse mirror. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. "You can't leave. You're part of it now." Oliver swung the crowbar, but it passed through the figure as if it weren't there. The figure raised its hand, and darkness engulfed the room. Oliver screamed, feeling as though he were falling, the voices consuming him. When he woke up, he was sitting in the chair, the door to the room closed and locked. He tried to stand, but he couldn't move. His reflection in the opposite wall revealed why. His face was now as featureless as the figures. A month later, the apartment was listed for rent again. The landlord showed it to a bright-eyed young woman who admired the old building's charm. "What's behind that door?" she asked. "Oh, just an old storage room," the landlord replied with a smile. "Nothing to worry about." The whispers began the first night she moved in. It was a freezing January night in the small town of Aspen Falls. The streets were blanketed in snow, the streetlights casting an eerie glow through the foggy air. Jenny Harper, a 23-year-old art student, was home alone in her grandmother's Victorian-era house. Her grandmother, who had passed away 6 months ago, had left Jenny the house in her will. The house was beautiful but old, with creaky floorboards, dimly lit hallways, and a massive antique mirror that hung in the living room. The mirror was the centerpiece of the house, its ornate golden frame tarnished with age. But there was something unsettling about it, something Jenny couldn't quite put her finger on. Jenny was curled up on the couch, sketch pad in hand, trying to distract herself from the storm raging outside. The howling wind and the occasional creak of the house were unnerving, but she reassured herself that it was just the old wood shifting in the cold. At around 10 p.m., Jenny's pencil froze mid-sketch. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the mirror. She turned her head sharply, her heart pounding. The reflection showed the living room exactly as it was, her on the couch, her sketch pad on her lap, and the dim light of the lamp, but she could have sworn she saw something move. "Get it together, Jenny," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. She turned back to her drawing, but the unease lingered. An hour passed, and Jenny's focus on her sketch returned. The storm outside had grown more intense, the wind rattling the windows. She decided to make some tea and headed to the kitchen. As she passed by the mirror, she stopped abruptly. There it was again. Movement. But this time, it wasn't subtle. She saw a shadow dart across the reflection, heading toward the hallway. Jenny spun around, staring at the hallway behind her. It was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she tried to convince herself it was her imagination. But then she heard it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet, she couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down her spine. She clenched her fists and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Jenny returned to the living room, clutching her steaming cup of tea. She avoided looking directly at the mirror, the uneasiness now a gnawing fear in her gut. Max, her cat, leapt onto the couch beside her and began purring, his presence a small comfort. But then Max froze, his green eyes fixed on the mirror. He let out a low growl, his fur bristling. Jenny turned to the mirror, her heart racing. At first, she saw nothing unusual. But as she stared, a face slowly emerged in the reflection. It wasn't hers. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Jenny screamed, dropping her tea. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only her terrified reflection staring back at her. Jenny grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Mia. "Mia, something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something in the mirror." Mia laughed nervously. "You're probably just freaked out from being alone in that creepy house. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." "It's not my mind," Jenny insisted. "I saw it. It was watching me." Okay, Mia said. "I'll come over. Just hang tight." Jenny hung up, but the sense of dread didn't fade. She decided to cover the mirror with a sheet, hoping that would ease her anxiety. As she approached the mirror with the sheet in hand, she froze. Words were etched into the glass, appearing as if someone had written them with their finger. "Come closer." Jenny backed away, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the sheet. She grabbed Max and ran upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside, the house was eerily silent. Jenny sat on the bed, clutching her phone and waiting for Mia to arrive. Max hissed suddenly, staring at the door. Jenny's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mia. "I'm here." Relief washed over her, and she hurried downstairs. But as she reached the front door, she froze. The deadbolt was already unlocked, and the door was slightly ajar. Snow blew in, leaving a trail of icy footprints leading into the living room. Jenny's hands shook as she called Mia. "Where are you?" she whispered. "I'm still 5 minutes away," Mia replied. "Why?" Jenny's blood ran cold. "But you just texted me." "No, "I didn't," Mia said, her voice rising with alarm. "Jenny, get out of the house." Jenny dropped the phone, her survival instincts kicking in. She bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in her face, the deadbolt locking itself. She turned and saw the mirror in the living room, now uncovered. The reflection showed her standing there, but behind her, the pale figure was back, its grin wider and more menacing. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. When she faced the mirror again, the figure was closer, its hand reaching out of the glass. Jenny screamed and backed away as the figure began to emerge from the mirror, its skeletal body dripping with a black, tar-like substance. Mia arrived moments later, pounding on the front door. "Jenny, open up." Jenny grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. The figure let out an ear-piercing screech as it dissolved into smoke, the shards of the mirror sizzling where they lay. The door suddenly unlocked, and Mia burst in. Jenny collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The police arrived shortly after but found no evidence of an intruder. They chalked it up to stress and grief over Jenny's grandmother's death. But Jenny knew better. She moved out of the house the next day, leaving everything behind. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. One night, months later, Jenny noticed something strange in her apartment. The bathroom mirror had a single word written on it, fogged up from her shower. "Soon." The reflection behind her shifted, and the face returned, grinning wider than ever. It was a chilly October evening, and Emma Turner, a 19-year-old college student, had just returned home to her family's secluded suburban house after an exhausting day of classes. Her parents had left for a weekend retreat in the mountains, leaving her alone with strict instructions to keep the doors locked and call if she needed anything. Emma didn't mind being alone, she actually enjoyed the quiet. The house, a modest two-story structure with a wide porch and large windows, had always felt warm and inviting. But tonight, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, and an eerie silence hung over the neighborhood. Even the family dog, Max, refused to leave Emma's side, his ears perked up as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. After reheating some leftover pizza, Emma settled on the couch with a blanket, her laptop open to a true crime documentary. The soft glow of the TV illuminated the living room, and the occasional creak of the house settling was the only other sound. It was around 9:30 p.m. when Emma heard the first sound, a faint knock at the front door. She froze, her fork hovering over her plate. Max growled softly, his eyes fixed on the door. "Probably just a neighbor," Emma muttered, trying to convince herself as she approached the door cautiously. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty yard. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, before locking the deadbolt and returning to the couch. An hour passed without incident, and Emma began to relax, brushing off the knock as her imagination. But then, she felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. She glanced at the window, and for a split second, she thought she saw a face. She blinked and stared harder, but there was nothing there. The curtains swayed gently, though the windows were closed. Max sparked suddenly, his fur bristling, and bolted toward the back door. "Max, stop," Emma cried, her voice shaking. She grabbed her phone and followed him, her fingers hovering over the keypad to call 911. The back door was slightly ajar, the lock broken. A cold gust of wind blew in, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. Emma slammed the door shut, locking it with a chain this time. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she double-checked all the windows and doors. She picked up Max and cradled him, his trembling body doing little to calm her nerves. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "You should have answered the door." Emma's blood ran cold. She dropped her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The lights flickered, and the TV screen turned to static. Max barked wildly, staring at the hallway that led to the B. "No," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, this isn't happening." The basement door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness. Emma's breathing quickened as a low, guttural sound emanated from the stairs, a sound that didn't belong to any human or animal she knew. Emma grabbed a kitchen knife and backed into the living room, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. She tried to call her parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The message on her phone now read, No one's coming to help you." Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. She thought about running to the neighbors, but the nearest house was a good 10-minute walk through the woods. If someone, or something, was out there, she'd never make it. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the basement stairs. They were slow and deliberate, each one louder than the last. Emma gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles turning white. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then, a shadowy figure emerged at the edge of the hallway. It was tall and hunched, its face obscured by a tattered hood. Emma could barely make out its features, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly, unnatural yellow. "Who are you?" Emma screamed, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying her. Max growled and lunged forward, but the figure raised a long, bony hand and pointed at Emma. The lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Emma ran. She didn't know where to go, but her instincts screamed at her to move. She sprinted upstairs, slamming the door to her bedroom and shoving a dresser in front of it. Max whimpered at her feet, his tail tucked between his legs. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video. With trembling hands, she opened it. The footage showed her, sitting on the couch, eating pizza, and watching TV. The angle was from outside the living room window. A cold realization hit her: whoever, or whatever, was in the house had been watching her all evening. Suddenly, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the house. The figure was trying to break down the bedroom door. Emma screamed, clutching the knife as tears streamed down her face. The door burst open, and the figure stepped inside. Emma swung the knife wildly, her heart hammering in her chest. The blade connected with something solid, and the figure let out an inhuman shriek. Black, tar-like liquid oozed from its wound, sizzling as it hit the floor. The creature lunged at her, but Emma ducked and stabbed again, this time plunging the knife into its chest. It collapsed, writhing and screeching, before dissolving into a puddle of darkness. Emma stared at the spot where it had fallen, her body shaking with adrenaline. The room was silent again, save for her ragged breathing. By the time the police arrived, summoned by a neighbor who had heard the commotion, the house was eerily quiet. Emma tried to explain what had happened, but they found no evidence of an intruder, just the broken locks and the black stains on the floor. Her parents returned the next day, their faces pale with worry. Emma moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that she was still being watched. Months later, in her new apartment, Emma received another text from the same unknown number. "You can't run forever." As she stared at the message, the lights flickered, and the familiar sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. The house wasn't haunted. She was.